All right. I don't believe this is the last week. But I guess I'll have to. Well, while the machines decide whether or not they're going to have a relationship, I'm going to be talking about in addition to doing final prep and giving you the preferred answer to the midterms on Wednesday, talk about the time period between Reconstruction and now as it relates to some of the contemporary issues that we're dealing with, because they all have their roots in that time period. Let's see here. Once it decides. Okay, so let's see, 479. All right. All right, so part of, you may remember this from the syllabus, but part of the idea of this class is not only to get you to be able to question authority, because I think questioning authority is always a good thing, especially if you ask intelligent and hard questions. But also to make you kind of global citizens, so know what shapes your world and how others' worlds are shaped. So that's part of what the concept of Afrocentrism is. It's not about being centered on Africa or black people, but studying the ways of all people that you encounter and knowing that preferably in advance, but at least being able to form not so much opinions and beliefs based on your own stereotypes, but understanding what their worldview is. You don't have to believe them like they believe, but you have to understand that they believe what they believe and why they believe what they believe. So part of the things that we're dealing with today, for example, the whole question of, who's a citizen, now we're reconsidering, the Republicans are considering a path to immigrant because they got trounced so bad because, look, people who are citizens of the United States that are Latino, every day, or at least every month, 50,000 folks come of age that have ties to this country, that considers themselves citizens of this country, even if some people don't. All for also reasons of history. So, in terms of building a community, in whatever way your sense of community is built. So, one of the things we deal with, I came from a city that was built on racial plurality. It just simply was. And it stopped being that when it became part of America instead of Mexico. So, okay, Mexico elects the first black president and frees the slaves before America does. Right? That's the history of, California, Arizona, Colorado, etc. All of Mexico, northern Mexico, Alta California, as well as Baja California. So you can also be a teacher, a facilitator, a problem solver, dismantler of privilege, and a dispeller of ignorance, if you so choose. So I'm giving you the context to do that. So part of removing those barriers is a citizen is a person who benefits from a healthy society and is committed to maintaining that society's health to further benefit and pass those benefits on to their children, if any. Right? Broad definition that is attempting to bridge barriers, because there are. So if they see a benefit in limiting the benefits they enjoy from others for fear they will lose them, they will act in that way to basically limit those benefits. So as an example, whether it's raw citizenship or even humanity, we have reasons for creating certain barriers. I got an email from someone that was really concerned about, the influence of Islam in the United States, and that we're going to be under Sharia law in, 10 or 15 years if we don't watch out, because, they're allowing prayer, Muslim prayer in school in Toronto. Like, okay, this came from somebody from Arizona that's connected to a student I was working with. So I'm thinking, wait, Muslims? I'm sorry. I'm not concerned about them. There's reasons why I'm not concerned about them. Without re-quoting the Chris Rock line, I'm saying, look, the problems that you have, the person closed their letter with the whole Marine thing, Semper Fi. And I'm thinking, okay, one of the people that used to be an African-American employee here was a Montfort Point Marine, which we don't study until we get to World War II. Okay? But the Montfort Point Marines were the Marine version of the Tuskegee Airmen. All black unit in the Marines that, in addition to the Marine Regiment, experienced daily, if not hour, racial prejudice in wartime by their white officers and other people in the Corps. So it's not like everybody is, red, white, and blue. It's like, okay, you're black even though you're a Marine and serving in battle and distinction. Just like Tuskegee Airmen, just like Buffalo Soldiers, just like lots of other folks. So one of the things that we've discussed or talked about in terms of who's a citizen, who's not, who's accepted, who's not. So marriage equality, one of the things that we're dealing with today. So the norm on this continent before 1492 was, sexual diversity exists. We don't discriminate on the basis of it. Marriage equality. In slavery, we were not allowed to have our natural sexual diversity. We were forced to be heterosexual and Christian, even if we were neither to begin with in slavery. So, third of slaves are Muslim. They're not allowed to practice Islam under slavery. If they were gay or practicing one of the 12 kinds of marriage, if they came from a country that practiced that, they were not allowed to have that either. They were basically raped, whether they were, male or female. That was true, basically. We can assume that, Rufus King of King County in Washington, there was a movement to actually have King County not be named after him, but Martin Luther King. But no, we should share the honor because King was a gay slave owner. Like, wait, being gay trumps the slave owner? And you want to align with Martin Luther King about civil? No, I'm not sure that's working for us. Exactly. But we were neither, if we were sexually diverse, we were not allowed to be that within slavery. And we weren't even allowed to be heterosexually married under slavery, hence the practice you may have heard of jumping the broom, which dates back to this time. Okay, so there are barriers to exercising equal citizenship rights. So whether it's marriage, the vote, land ownership, military service, we've seen all those things. The Bible, or that version of the Bible, the King James version of the Bible, is used as a reference to deny rights to blacks. Also today used to deny rights to the sexually diverse. Now, essentially what this means is, even though the Constitution says we're a secular state, and there's a reason why we separate church and state, dating back to the Inquisition, basically the model is essentially a Christian norm being imposed, even though we're a secular state, theoretically. So by so we eliminated the biblical references to race, largely, but have imposed them or allowed them to stay in place. So it's like, why do we allow a Brahmic model of what is normal to continue to exist in a state like this? So part of the deal with the class is also we train you for the barriers till they're not barriers for you. And if they're not barriers for you, and you recognize that they're possibly a barrier for somebody else, the first step in eliminating the barrier is noting that the barrier is there. So we start internally with emotional and spiritual literacy, then print literacy, numeracy, which is basically, you could think of it as math skill, but it's not just math skill. It's also problem solving. What algebra is teaching you is problem solving where you have the internal resources already, and then working through the process to a solution or an answer. And that means then also developing a systemic literacy. So as an example, we look at the issue of voting from Kelly. Now we see this word freedmen. So on learning to read and write, exhorting people, for example, in Boston in 1865, you ask me what the North thinks about letting the Negro vote. My answer is 2/3 of the North are willing he should vote, and one of these thirds is determined he shall vote and will not rest until he does. But the opposition is very strong. I fear we may see it if put off for many a year. Possibly there may be an agreement made that those who can read and write shall vote and no others. So think about that. Limiting the vote to the literate. On the surface, it looks like a good idea, right? That is, if universal access to literacy is a policy. But that could also be a barrier. How do you limit access to literacy? And what I've also said is numeracy. And it can be as simple as, because I deal with people on all parts of the spectrum. So imagine not being able to help your kid with elementary school math because you don't know how to convert fractions. and what it takes to be able to convert fractions. Having simple math. Well, I can't do a recipe because I don't know what a quarter cup is. I just throw all the ingredients together. They didn't tell me you need to separate dry and wet ingredients. I just put them all together. Now the person can read, but their math skill, they freeze up when they see a fraction, and of course, recipes are fractions. Right? Seems, well, that might not relate to you, but you know, that's a barrier for folks. So, how do they get that training? Because in this time, when this is being set up, there are no public schools except for the ones that black people create for themselves and allow white people to come to. No public schools, all private, in terms of the state. So, limiting people to literacy? Huh. And then they start developing all kinds of other interesting rules under the black codes, like you can't, and that they actually applied in elections in the 21st century, like a literacy test before you can vote, then answering certain questions, not having to do with the judicial process, but how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? I'm not making that up. Blacks were not allowed to vote. They answered questions, and one of the questions was, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? Guess how many beans are in the jar? You get to vote. Better get it right. Right? Impossible answers. Bubbles in a bar of soap. I thought that was really clever. So, by what right do you who makes the rule to decide who becomes a citizen or not? Every human being present? Can we take a voice vote, whether you read or not? So it depends on what your concept of who a citizen is and what democracy is. Urge, therefore, every colored man at once, every colored man. No, notice there's no reference to colored women or Indian nations or other immigrants, because there are other immigrants. At once to learn to read and write. His right to vote may be very likely depend on that. Let him lose no time, but learn to read and write at once. So, even if you were literate, that eliminates one barrier, but then they create other barriers. So, I mean, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about last week about the black codes. The chains come off, they impose other barriers. Look for that. It's a time-honored strategy. What was once done to us for race, now being done to you for the money or to block access. Let's see what next. So once we get the vote, then if you look at, let's see, zoom in. That's on Kelly and page 249. There's a diversity exercise we used to do. So, X's and O's, not hugs and kisses, but what is your eye drawn to? The O's, right? So if you're, as I said before, if you're a raisin in a sea of buttermilk, who gets noticed? So you notice then, there are a lot of black faces here. And one of the reasons, again, when I first started creating the class years and years ago and being able, in studying, okay, these folks got elected to the Mississippi legislature right out of slavery. And they're able to speak, many of them are able to speak multiple languages and travel abroad to Europe and speak in the language of the country that they're in. And they didn't learn that from an American school. How are they able to do that if slaves are savages? That's quite a leap from going from savagery to slavery to, boom, state legislature and the world stage. Right? So even though their numbers are greater, or at least most in Mississippi, there's still resistance to them being there. So, what miscegenation is. So, what we are to expect now that Mr. Lincoln is reelected. So, I mean, in this last campaign and also in 2008, but certainly in the reelection, we're going to lose our country if Obama's reelected. I mean, it's the same tropes. Yeah, what are we to expect? The race is mixing. Lincoln is reelected. What I liked about this piece, besides the before the war and since the war, giving into kind of an idyllic thing, is basically the family record, being able to trace your genealogy, who your people, as far back as you can go. How far are you able to do that? Now, because of adoption and a lot of other things, people have kind of lost that ability to name their generations. And there's a certain cultural wounding that comes along with that inability. And that's part of what being American is, in a sense, is that, yeah, you can't trace your roots past grandma and grandpa, if that. And so this is the country, this is probably one of the few countries that does that besides. In Europe, they have genealogy books where you can trace your roots. You can actually go there and look in the books, look up your family name, going back centuries. Here we have Ancestry.com. Which, gives some people partial records, but the idea is, I mean, when I look at this and I'm saying, okay, I know the author's sister who does diversity work in terms of health, working with health disparities, et cetera, so they're carrying on this family tradition of, this is what we've done for generations. This is who we are. We've been activists. So I understand that that's how I was raised. To think that was normal, to be in touch with grandparents and great-grandparents and the doings of relatives going back as far as we can remember. And that was not necessarily the American norm. So when Kelly basically includes something like this as a document, just saying that that's actually a tradition. Place like Howard University and the creation of HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. So they talk about Howard, Fisk, Atlanta University, Clark, Alcorn, Bethune-Cookman, Hampton Institute, Richmond, and many others. Grambling, etc. Basically, we're created to train professionals, to create an infrastructure, because many times black professionals could not basically work in the white mainstream. So everything was segregated, so we had to have our own doctors, our own lawyers, our own police, etc. And places like HBCUs and Howard were basically created during this time of post-war and Reconstruction to create that infrastructure. And let's see. And then Nolens. 277. So, post-Reconstruction. So, students from an integrated school in New Orleans. So, one could say that New Orleans is probably the most African city in America, and has been since before America. So, and there were some integrated schools in the West and the North, allowing basically the so-called races to go to school together. But in the South, only New Orleans approved that kind of arrangement because of the peculiar history of New Orleans, which basically had to do with not only, since it was a French city, part of Louisiana, you had separate classes of people where you could have free people of color that were both French and American, marrying and possessing slaves, usually black slaves, and then also many wealthy white men, in addition to being married to white women, had black mistresses in the black part of town in New Orleans, with separate families that didn't necessarily mix. But the arrangement was known about, because the French are notoriously one could say, more liberal-minded in that. I mean, the whole thing with the French president and his mistress, and we trip about that, but they don't. So the idea is, okay, you're having black teachers teach white kids and black kids together. But that not necessarily being the model in the rest of America. Talking to each other? Good. So, in that concept, conscientiousism, right? Learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and take actions against the oppressive elements of reality. In David Bradley's book, The Chaney'sville Incident, from which I adapted that the stillness which comes to all, it was a section within that story, gives a scatology. So scatology is literally the study of feces. So, from if I gave you a scatology